the world's two most populous nations that both happen to have nuclear weapons.
India and China, two global superpowers, share a 2,167-mile border, which the two countries have disputed for close to a century now. As I hinted to a few minutes ago, these two countries went to war over this border in 1962, ending with a standoff that continues, well, to this day. A modern war between these two armed and nuclear nations would be devastating. When you factor in the fact that, combined, the countries account for 35% of the global population and 21% of the global GDP, you start to have a measure of how disastrous conflict between these two can prove to be. The border itself is divided into 3 sections and constitutes one of the longest contested borders in the world. The first section stretches east of Bhutan, where the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh is claimed by the Chinese to be a part of southern Tibet. The second section is a narrow 50-mile stretch of land that spans between Nepal and Bhutan. This border region is small but strategically important to India, in that it connects India's far eastern states with the bulk of the country. Parts of this region are claimed by Bhutan in addition to China and India. The third section runs north of Tibet and borders the Indian territory of Ladakh and the Chinese region of Aksai Chin. China and India dispute the location of each of these borders. The border region is especially mountainous, resulting in poorly defined boundaries, so accidental incursions are common. Furthermore, similar to other borders drawn during the colonial period, the Sino-Indian border had little consent from the two countries, especially China. China claims to share historical and cultural ties with the people on the Indian side of the border. Also, the Ladakh region is the base for the Tibetan independence movement and potentially provides China with a more direct pathway to Pakistan. Given how good China-Pakistan relations are, this is something they would especially want. The border issue between the two nations did not just come out of thin air. No. It was an issue that was always there, that just needed to be clarified, but it never was. You see, after India's independence, 3 major factors contributed to the entrenchment of the border dispute. First, and perhaps most importantly, was the reluctance of both India and China to broach the subject in the initial phase from 1950 to 1957, when Sino-Indian ties were peaceful and amicable, and the two countries had many high-level diplomatic exchanges, which provided the leaders with ample opportunities to settle the ambiguities left over from the colonial period. However, the two countries not only avoided the boundary issue, but also followed unilateral policies. This would come back to haunt them later on. The Indian government failed to consult China before declaring the forwardmost posts in the eastern and western sectors. It annexed Tawang in 1951. And it published new maps reflecting India's unilateral demarcation. Throughout all of this, China said nothing, and India mistakenly interpreted China's silence as tacit consent. Jawaharlal Nehru, India's former prime minister, admitted in 1953 that even while India inherited the McMahon Line from the British, he was not so willing to raise the subject lest it awaken sleeping dogs. Similarly, per Mao Zedong's instructions, the People's Republic of China followed a delaying strategy, with China deciding to refrain from formally protesting against New Delhi's unilateral moves until they had consolidated their administrative and military positions in Tibet, as China had begun building the Xinjiang National Highway in 1951, a road that would not be completed until 1957. Moreover, during the 1954 negotiations on Tibet, China chose not to raise the issue of border alignment despite having the opportunity. And in 1956, when Nehru for the first time referred to the boundary issue, Zhou Enlai, former premier of the People's Republic of China, suggested that the Chinese government would be willing to recognize the McMahon Line. Later scholarly works revealed that a combination of domestic and international factors influenced the policy choices of both countries. For instance, New Delhi's trauma from previous territorial losses due to partition and Nehru's desire to maintain friendly relations with China weighed heavily on Indian decision-makers. Simultaneously, Beijing, too embroiled in China's internal struggles and facing international diplomatic isolation, was reluctant to immediately open another confrontational front with India. In retrospect, however, the deferral policy followed by both countries proved to be, well, disastrous. because as suspicion and misperceptions mounted on both sides, the window of opportunity to settle the border dispute only became narrower. This resulted in the eventual border discussions being, well, not so diplomatic. In fact, the two superpowers fought a war back in 1962 over the disputed territory. This war was precipitated by the 1959 Tibetan Uprising, which subsequently resulted in a series of violent border skirmishes between the two countries. India established a number of outposts along the border. Meanwhile, the Chinese People's Liberation Army was commencing patrols in Ladakh. War broke out in October of 1962, with the PLA pushing Indian forces back. Following international pressure to end the war, the countries established a ceasefire in November, and China withdrew to the line of actual control, which now forms the current border. The casualties from the war were unclear, with both sides understating their own losses and inflating the other side's losses. Several things about the border persist even after the war, and uncertainty over their non-resolution makes the reality of a modern war ever so present for both nations. This is a headache for India and hence one of their biggest geographic crises, this time with perhaps an army that is better than their own. So, what are the points argued by each country? Well, remember the three sectors of the border dispute that I mentioned before? India argues that the western sector was demarcated by the 1842 agreement between Tibet and Kashmir, and that the eastern sector was finalized by the Simla Agreement in 1913 through 1914. Therefore, no further demarcation is required. China, in turn, states that no formal treaty or agreement has ever been signed between the Indian and Chinese governments. For China, neither sent any representative to the India-Tibet negotiations nor ratified the McMahon Line. In this context, China views the establishment of the state of Arunachal Pradesh as a unilateral step by India, and this amounts to an illegal occupation of China's Tibet. From a broader perspective, the two countries disagree, first on the size of the border and the locations which are disputed. The Indian position is that the Sino-Indian boundary is a total of 3,488 kilometers in length, including 523 kilometers of what India calls the Pakistan-occupied Kashmir-China section, with the western sector being 1,597 kilometers, the middle sector 545 kilometers, and the eastern sector 1,346 kilometers in length. Here, India accuses China of occupying 38,000 square kilometers of land in the Kashmir region, along with 5,180 kilometers of land in the Kashmir region which was ceded to it by Pakistan. Also, India claims Aksai Chin to be part of India's Ladakh region, and India has no dispute as far as the eastern sector is concerned. On the other hand, as narratives often have, the Chinese position is that the Sino-Indian border is not more than 2,000 kilometers. The western sector roughly covers Karakoram Mountain and is about 600 kilometers long. The disputed area in this sector is 33,000 square kilometers and currently lies under Chinese control. The middle sector is roughly 450 kilometers long and has a disputed area of 2,000 square kilometers, and the eastern sector is 650 kilometers and has a disputed area of 90,000 square kilometers occupied by India. Contrary to India's position, China asserts that the eastern sector of the border is the most contentious part, as the McMahon Line is illegitimate, and China therefore claims the Indian state of Arunachal Pradesh. In the western sector, China contends that Ladakh is a disputed region. You can almost understand just why India's former prime minister did not want to open a can of worms, and in his own words, chose to let sleeping dogs lie. As we dive into this topic, please take a second to like this video. As you can see, I have an affinity for covering topics that no one else likes to talk about, and really that doesn't often get me on the right side of the algorithm. So your likes really help out the videos a lot. After fighting a whole war and not having any resolution agreed upon, the two nations had to be obliged by a line of actual control for peace purposes as guided by the international community. Even though this peace line has, well, it's been a major issue. The two Asian nations cannot come to a determination of the line of actual control. India rejects the Chinese version of the line of actual control, describing it as a series of disconnected points on a map. New Delhi also claims that the line of actual control should be based on military positions before China's 1962 attack. discounting any gains made during that war. This would be advantageous to them given that they, lost that war soundly. China, on the other hand, insists that the line of actual control should be the status quo attained after the 1962 war, which is incidentally the territorial arrangements suggested by Zhou Enlai during the 1960 negotiations. On the eastern side, it coincides mostly with the McMahon Line, while in the western and middle sectors, the line of actual control follows the traditional customary line pointed out by China. However, China only describes it in general terms, without precise scales on the map. Owing to such disagreements between the two countries, the line of actual control, even after 50 years of conflict, remains undemarcated. The demarcation and implementation of the LAC is deeply associated with the larger process of negotiations on border alignment. The Chinese leadership and officials hold the determination of the line of actual control to be a critical matter, and have usually followed an extremely reserved approach. In 1999, the issue of demarcation of the line of actual control gained momentum during the visit of India's then External Affairs Minister Jaswant Singh. The two sides also formally exchanged their respective maps of the middle sector in 2001. However, 1 year later, an Indian proposal to set a time frame for exchanging maps and addressing the clarification of the western and eastern sectors failed to elicit a cogent response from China, and the matter stagnated. Indian experts observed that the Chinese lack of interest in providing the clarification on the line of actual control is related to Beijing's shift in policy on the border dispute. In the post-war period, China withdrew the package deal originally proposed by Zhou Enlai, and now claims the entire state of Arunachal Pradesh. Although initially Chinese interest in Arunachal Pradesh were limited only to Tawang, in recent years their claims have expanded to include the entire state. For instance, in 2006, before the visit to India by China's then-president Hu Jintao, the PRC ambassador to India declared all of Arunachal Pradesh to be Chinese territory, and that Tawang was merely a small portion of it. Chinese commenters lament that it was a great political mistake on Chinese part to give up NEFA, or modern-day Arunachal Pradesh. In 2007, Chinese Foreign Minister Yang Jiechi stated that the presence in populated areas would not affect Chinese claims, a stance that is problematic because it is a clear reversal of Beijing's earlier agreement to abide by the principle to safeguard the interests of the settled populations in the border areas. It also suggests that, in the future, China might unilaterally reject any principle that is inconvenient to its national interests. In response to Indian allegations, China argues that there are two reasons why China is reluctant to demarcate the line of actual control. First, because such a process will take both countries back to the historical disputes and once again entrap bilateral ties within the historical and legal approach, which in turn will inhibit the overall development of Sino-Indian relations. Second, China is charging New Delhi with taking advantage of the clarification process to increase the disputed area into places where no dispute existed before, although Beijing is unable to provide any concrete evidence to support this claim. The border region was relatively quiet until 2017 due to a series of agreements between India and China that maintained the peace. However, in recent years there have been an increase in cross-border violence and disputes, with both sides fortifying their sides of the border. In 2017, the PLA, the People's Liberation Army, extended a road into the Doklam region by Bhutan. India responded by sending troops into the region to halt the construction. But by August of that year, both sides had withdrawn their forces. May of 2020 saw another confrontation when Indian and Chinese troops engaged in a series of skirmishes along the border, spurred on by an Indian road construction project in the Ladakh region. While most of these skirmishes merely amounted to face-offs and taunts, a large melee fight broke out in mid-June, resulting in the deaths of 20 Indian soldiers and an unspecified number of Chinese soldiers. The fight only involved hand-to-hand combat and did not include the firing of weapons. However, a few months later, both sides began exchanging sporadic gunfire across the border. In the subsequent year, both sides continued to build infrastructure along the border, supporting their claims to each territory. India sent 12,000 workers to develop Indian roads and infrastructure along the border, including a road infrastructure project in Ladakh. Meanwhile, China has been building villages along the eastern portion of the border, some of which are Indian-claimed and Bhutan-claimed territories. Both sides continually claim that the opposite countries are amassing troops along the border and building defensive positions to fortify their claims to the regions. The issue is further complicated by the accusations and bold statements being pushed out by government officials and state-aligned media outlets from both countries. However, with all this said and done, I think that the prospect of a modern war between India and China is something that's not going to happen. Quite simply, neither side would have a substantial benefit from a war. Fighting in the Himalayas is challenging and would rely heavily on dismounted operations. The terrain and weather would make logistics difficult, to say the least, while also destroying soldier morale. Moreover, neither side has a definitive advantage in technology that could prove them an edge in a war. It would be a gruesome battle of attrition, which both sides would naturally want to avoid. Although the overall outcome of this dispute is uncertain, it will likely continue for some time. Both sides appear to be using this border dispute to create a sense of nationalism and restore faith in the federal government, following poor responses to national issues, for example, the COVID-19 pandemic. Media agencies in both countries are pushing out questionable reports about the actions of the opposite country and glorifying their own responses. China has elevated Qi Haobao, a PLA commander injured in the melee with Indian forces in 2020, to being a national icon, including carrying the Olympic torch. Meanwhile, the Indian film industry has launched several television shows and movies centered around the 1962 Sino-Indian War. To add to all of this, both countries are vying for dominance in the region and do not want to appear weak. The border dispute provides both countries the opportunity to flaunt their military and economic strengths. This is critical for both countries, given India's relationship with Pakistan and China's relationship with the West. Chinese media has reported numerous cutting-edge technologies being fielded to the region, including exoskeletons and armed robots. While both technologies provided little tactical value for this situation, the dispute proved an outlet for advertising these technologies. Meanwhile, India is showing that it will not be pushed by China, responding to the border dispute by deploying troops into the region. They have also responded politically by sanctioning numerous Chinese apps, including TikTok, which has more than 200 million users in India. Add to that the skipping of the opening ceremony of the Winter Olympics held in Beijing. To put it simply, the border dispute between India and China is one that is very important, given the role that both countries play in the region and globally. The combination of mistrust, a desire to exude dominance, and an ambiguous border has the potential to lead to a war eventually. However, in the meantime, India and China will likely maintain the standoff with little resolution. What has been proven is that the border issue has the ability to affect bilateral matters. And so as time goes on, we'll see just how much the border issues can affect the two most powerful nations in Asia. As you guys know, YouTube has a habit of restricting my videos, and sometimes it's not even YouTube's fault. It's the brands that run ads on YouTube. They don't want their ads next to quote-unquote controversial videos. So they tell YouTube to restrict controversial videos like mine that cover geopolitics. That means sometimes I have to forego covering certain news topics because I know YouTube will restrict that video. But often those controversial topics are important news that you guys ought to know about. And that's why I launched Global Recaps, my own geopolitics newsletter. Every day I send an email directly to your inbox covering the world's most important news. And there's no third party censoring any topic. If it's important, it'll be in the email so you guys can know about it. These are short and simple emails that take about 5 minutes to read. News topics covered in the emails are unbiased, uncensored, and completely free. So sign up now by going to globalrecaps.com or using the link in the description and become more knowledgeable about the world you live in. India has launched a war against China. And it's not a war that will be fought on the battlefield. Rather, it's a war that will be fought economically. India has started emerging as the next great powerhouse of Asia in order to counter China's aggression. New Delhi has now positioned itself as an alternative for companies that are getting tired of being used like a pawn in the CCP's grand ambition towards taking over the world. Companies like Apple are already moving to India to set up for a world after China. India has slowly launched its own global projects to counteract China's growing influence from the Belt and Road Initiative. Prime Minister Modi has started India's own lending program for its neighbors, in order to stop China from gaining influence by using its debt trap diplomacy. So today, let's go over how India became China's greatest threat.
The head of MI6 last year accused China of using debt traps to gain leverage over countries.
Sri Lanka sought China's financial help. The country took loans worth $45 billion from various countries, including more than $8 billion from China.
An agreement for a $1 billion credit line from India.
The fast patrol vessel will be the fourth ship to be gifted by India to Seychelles.
Pakistan is all set to receive a $700 million loan from China to help it shore its foreign exchange reserves, which are at a 10-year low.
This video took a lot of effort. Recently, my videos have been getting age restricted, which severely hurts their reach with the algorithm, and doesn't really make that much sense. So if you guys can please take a second and hit the like button below, it will help me out a lot. Thank you. So let's start from the beginning. Something that might surprise most of you is the fact that historically, India and China were strong allies and friendly economic partners. The Silk Road linked the cities of Xi'an in China and Pataliputra in India. Trade on the tea and horse road, as the Chinese called it, was a significant factor in the growth of Chinese and Indian civilizations. Coming into modern history, both civilizations had their hands full with their colonizers, as India had the British and China had the Japanese. That didn't stop their leaders from supporting each other. Even under British rule, Indian leaders publicly showed their support for China's struggles against the Japanese. In 1939, future Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, visited China as an honored guest of the government. Both countries actually helped each other in their battles. India helped China against the Japanese and Western imperialism, and in return, China supported India's independence movement against the British. Then, in 1947, India gained its independence from the British Empire. And 2 years later, in 1949, the People's Republic of China, or PRC, came into power in China. This is where the relationship could have soured. Up to this point, Indian leaders had been friendly with the ROC, the Republic of China. When Mao Zedong's PRC came into power, the ROC fled mainland China and took over Taiwan. I'm sure you guys are already familiar with the China-Taiwan issue, so I won't go into it right now. But good relations between the two nations continued, even under new leadership. In fact, India was one of the first countries in the world to recognize the People's Republic of China as the official government of China. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru also became the first foreign leader to visit the PRC in China in 1954, this time to meet with the PRC leader Mao Zedong. Nehru described the visit as the most important foreign mission of his life. He considered India and China to be very similar. He believed as a newly free nation, they couldn't trust the West. They needed to depend on each other to grow their economy and improve living conditions for their citizens. They jointly signed and advocated for the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence. But peace, it didn't last long. As soon as the CCP came into power in 1950, they forcibly took over the autonomous region of Tibet by sending loads of military personnel. I have a full video on this story, which was actually demonetized and restricted by YouTube the first time I uploaded it. Good times. I highly recommend you check it out for the full details on this story. But here's a quick recap. After taking over the region in 1950, the CCP slowly kept increasing its military presence in Tibet. As you can imagine, this really pissed off the local Tibetan population, as the CCP was not giving them their religious and cultural freedom. Chairman Mao wanted Tibet to be a Chinese territory. It didn't matter to him that the people there had their own culture and history. So in 1958, a rebellion broke out in Tibet against CCP forces. Tibetans wanted to kick out the CCP and take back their land. But Mao decided to send in even more forces to reassert his dominance. Local Tibetan rebels stood no chance against the People's Liberation Army, or PLA, who had a numbers advantage and experience on their side. India was closely following this clampdown. India had always had a friendly relationship with Tibet, including an economic relationship where North India would freely trade with Tibet. Indian leaders decided not to get involved in this fight, as to not cause a war with their neighbor. Mao, on the other hand, did not share the same feelings about keeping the peace. Declassified documents from decades later have shown that Mao was always paranoid that India was colluding with the USA and the Soviets to overthrow Chinese leadership. Looking back, this really doesn't make any sense. The USA and the USSR were in a pretty intense Cold War in the 1960s, and while India was a neutral nation that was friendly with both sides, I highly doubt the USA and the Soviet Union would set aside the Cold War and collude together to overthrow the leadership in China. Anyway, coming back to the Tibet story. In 1959, the Dalai Lama, fearing for his life in Tibet, fled to India, where he was granted asylum. This, of course, didn't please Chairman Mao, as he saw this action as India playing a role in supporting the rebels against the CCP. This in turn made him more aggressive towards India, and Mao decided to show his aggression by encroaching on India's borders. Speaking of borders, there's one point I quickly want to go over that's actually pretty important. In 1914, while India was still under British control, representatives from Britain, China, and Tibet gathered to determine the status of Tibet. China agreed to allow Tibet to be an autonomous region and remain under Chinese control, but they refused to put the promise in a treaty. Britain and Tibet, on the other hand, signed a treaty creating this line called the McMahon Line. India, to this day, accepts the McMahon Line as the official legal border between India and Tibet. The CCP, on the other hand, well, they didn't accept the McMahon Line, and in 1959, they kept pushing the limits at these borders to show their displeasure. This caused both sides to increase their military presence around the border. And then, in August of 1959, the first bloody clash erupted between the two nations. On the west side of the border, Chinese soldiers pushed into Indian territory. Then, a month later, clashes happened on the east border. This is when India learned that China had built a road inside of Indian territory, which has remained a pretty big issue to this day. To settle these issues, China offered India the west side of the border if India agrees to give China more territory on the east side. India, of course, declined this offer, and firefights kept happening for the next few years. Then, in 1962, Chinese soldiers discovered an Indian post in territory that they believed to be under China's borders. This news traveled to Mao, and he saw this as the final straw. Mao decided to send tens of thousands of soldiers in secret to both east and west sides of disputed borders. The People's Liberation Army swiftly launched an attack on both sides, surprising the Indian soldiers who were both outnumbered and inexperienced. The PLA, on the other hand, had plenty of fighting experience from their wars in Korea, Vietnam, and Taiwan. Indian troops suffered a humiliating defeat, and the CCP was able to capture much of Indian territory. The Indian Army tried setting up a counteroffensive by bringing in more soldiers, but Mao was ready for it and squashed it pretty easily. This is when India asked the USA military for help to take back its territory. At this time, the USA was one of the only two countries who had nukes, the second one being the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, this was also one of the few issues that the USA and the Soviets agreed on. They both saw China as the aggressor in this situation, and since China didn't want to experience their own Hiroshima, they decided to withdraw most of their troops from Indian territory. However, the CCP did decide to keep control of a piece of Indian territory here in the Aksai China region, the same area where they had built a road connecting Xiancheng to Lhasa. Remember this, as this is an issue still to this day. Another ideological goal Mao had with this attack was to stop India from aligning with the USA in the Cold War. Mao's thinking was that if he can show India that China is much stronger, India will be afraid to do anything that will piss off China. But this attack kind of caused the exact opposite to happen. India and the US had become even closer, as they both now had a common enemy in China. This war also changed the borders between India and China. Now this is where the problems start. China attacked India, captured territory, and the new unofficial border was basically in Indian territory. In 1967, another war broke out, and this time India was able to push back some of the Chinese soldiers and regained some of its territories. This changed what China controlled in terms of territory versus what China believed to be its territory. China believes that everything claimed in 1962 is a part of China, but it lost some of that in 1967. India still honors the McMahon Line agreement and believes that China is still illegally occupying Indian territory. This is the reason behind a lot of subsequent clashes that have happened here. Both countries have soldiers patrolling the area, and both countries have different definitions of where their borders end. I mean, you can tell why this is a recipe for clashes, right? Luckily, both countries realize that. But China refused to come to a peaceful agreement about the border dispute. However, they did agree that soldiers from both countries cannot use military weapons against each other, meaning no guns allowed in the 2-mile strip around the supposed line of actual control. These border disagreements are a big reason behind the India-China bitterness towards each other. But the problems don't stop here. As China grew economically, its ambitions on the world stage grew as well. After Mao's passing, Deng Xiaoping opened China up to the rest of the world with his open-door policy. This policy quite literally changed China's economy and its place in the world. It was able to attract foreign businesses to China and quickly transform the country into a manufacturing hub. Millions of people were lifted out of poverty, and China went from a farming nation to the second biggest economy in the world. But as the population started getting older and growth from attracting foreign manufacturing slowed down, the CCP was forced to look elsewhere for future growth. So it decided to feed two birds with one stone. You see, for a nation to be a superpower, for it to be a formidable force on the world stage, it needs to increase its influence with other nations, and it needs to decrease its dependency on its enemies. In short, China needed to get stronger and minimize its weaknesses. Now we skip forward a little bit in our story, because this plan was set in motion by Xi Jinping when he was elected.
Taking the center stage, China's new president and commander-in-chief of the People's Liberation Army, Xi Jinping.
Xi Jinping. As votes were counted, there was little surprise.
He got 99.86% of the vote.
China's Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI is a gigantic plan for a global network of ports, roads, railways, and other infrastructure to connect China to the world.
After being elected president, Xi Jinping launched the most ambitious project in history to increase China's influence around the world. China would give out loans to poor, struggling nations in the guise of helping nations that once struggled like they did. But in return, China gained control over countries with valuable resources or in a strategic location. Now you may ask, what if these poor countries can't pay back the loans? Well, China would then get control over important resources like gold, silver, oil, and access. China carefully used loans to gain influence on struggling nations and also choke out its enemies. A prime example being India. If you look at the map of the Belt and Road Initiative, you can clearly see that there's one country that's left out. Not only that, it seems like India is being encircled by this project that is controlled by China. Before we get into how China is doing that exactly, let's first go over why China is doing this. You see, China believes it needs to do this in order to survive. China's economy is very interconnected to the rest of the world, especially to Western countries. Around 1/5 of China's GDP is from its exports, the USA being its biggest export partner, accounting for more than $500 billion or 17% of all of China's exports. The dependency doesn't stop there. If you look at China's top 10 export partners, 9 of them are US allies. More than 50% of China's exports are going to countries that are likely to side with the USA if there's a war. Additionally, China is one of the biggest importers of oil. China imports almost double the amount of oil that the USA does, and the majority of that oil flows from the Middle East, which is transported through the Indian Ocean. All of this oil passes through what some might consider to be one of the most important geopolitical choke points here in the Strait of Malacca. It's projected that 80% of China's oil flows through this strait. This strait is in the territorial waters of Indonesia, Malaysia, and Singapore. This strait is a very big weakness for China. In case of any war or political disagreement, this strait could easily be blocked off by enemies like India or the USA. Without access to this route, it's very hard for China to get the energy to fuel its economy, let alone a war. In today's world, oil is the lifeblood of the economy and its government. China's solution to this problem is to build its own alternate route, using the Belt and Road Initiative. China has built pipelines both in Myanmar and Pakistan from the coast to intercity China. It secured long port leases in Pakistan and Sri Lanka. Similarly, China has also set up a military base in Djibouti to control Bab el-Mandeb, a vital strait off the coast of Djibouti that links the Red Sea to the Indian Ocean. Persian Gulf and Asian exports bound for Western markets must first pass through Bab el-Mandeb before reaching the Suez Canal. Between 12.5% and 20% of all global trade passes through this strait. Only 8 miles from China's base is Camp Lemonnier. After seeing all the moves China has been making, a lot of military experts have pointed out that the Belt and Road is not just a geo-economic plan. It also has a military strategic advantage. The ports have increasingly come to play a potentially more menacing role. As dual-use ports that can give the strengthened Chinese Navy a global reach it lacked entirely just a few years ago. These strategic investments are nicknamed the String of Pearls, as the goal is to encircle India and put pressure on New Delhi. India was aware of this already, but the war in Ukraine showed every country in the world how important it is to secure your economic interest. In the modern world, wars can be won and lost before even stepping foot on the battlefield. India realized that, in the case of a war, China's String of Pearls can be used as a way to choke off India's access to the world, on top of safeguarding Chinese interests. Adding to this, countries that received Chinese money were slow to criticize China whenever it would start skirmishes on the disputed border with India, like it did in 2017 and 2020. There's also a rumor that China plans to start setting up military bases in countries that received Chinese loans. And of course, this was undoubtedly stressful for New Delhi, as it didn't want to be surrounded by the Chinese military. So, India started laying out its own plan to safeguard its economic interests. But it didn't just stop there. Later in the video, we'll go over how India is taking advantage of China's trade war with the USA to hurt China where it's the strongest, its manufacturing prowess. But first, let's go over how India is countering China's military. To counter the String of Pearls, India started its own alliance to encircle China, nicknamed the Necklace of Diamonds. India is expanding its naval bases and is also improving relations with strategically placed countries to counter China's strategies. In 2018, India partnered with Singapore and Indonesia to get access to their naval bases of Changi and Sabang. This increased India's influence and access to the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important choke points for China and the rest of the world in terms of trade. That same year, India also got military access to the port of Duqm in Oman. This port facilitates India's crude imports from the Persian Gulf. In addition to this, the Indian facility is located right between two important Chinese pearls, Djibouti in Africa and Gwadar in Pakistan. India has also signed an agreement with Seychelles for a naval base in the region, which will increase India's presence near the African continent. While doing this, India has also extended credit lines to Iran and agreed to build a port in the country to extend access to trade routes in Central Asia. Additionally, India has extended credit lines in Central Asia to countries like Mongolia, where Modi has agreed to develop a bilateral air corridor. New Delhi has invested a lot in policies to improve relations with Japan and Vietnam. These relations have helped increase Indian trade and, consequently, India's influence on countries around China. But India realized this alone isn't enough. It has also taken big steps towards speeding up its economic growth while taking business away from China. You see, the China-US trade war and COVID provided countries like India with a unique opportunity. Because of economic growth in the past couple of decades, living standards and wages in China have gone up dramatically. This has become an issue for companies that moved to China for their low labor costs. Furthermore, tariffs from the trade war have added even more costs, and the headache of operating in China increased multiple-fold because of Xi's COVID clampdown. This is where companies started looking outwards for their manufacturing needs. For many countries, India provided a perfect solution. India's population is fast-growing, and according to the UN, it's officially now the biggest nation in the world, overtaking China this year. Furthermore, the Indian population is a lot younger when compared to China's aging demographic. The median age in India is 28, a lot younger when compared to China's 38. A big portion of Indian workers speak English. In fact, India has the second largest English-speaking population, only behind the USA. This definitely makes things a lot easier for companies looking to set up shop in India. Certain companies have already noticed these benefits and taken advantage of them. One example of this is Apple, which has already moved some of its iPhone production to the Indian states of Tamil Nadu and Karnataka, and is exploring moving its iPad manufacturing to the South Asian nation. JP Morgan analysts even made calculations, and their projections show that 1 in 4 iPhones would be made in India by 2025. India is simply capitalizing on the vulnerabilities that COVID exposed in China. The need for Apple to reduce its dependence on China as a manufacturing center has been clear for many years, but the impact of the pandemic at the world's biggest iPhone assembly plant really underlined the problem. The COVID-19 related disruption was estimated to cost the company $1 billion weekly. It makes sense that Apple wants to avoid this kind of mess again. The Indian government is welcome to deals, as Indian Prime Minister Modi has been working on attracting foreign direct investments since he took office in 2014, sending FDI to a record $83.6 billion in the past fiscal year. With low-cost labor available, low cost of production, and a willing government, it's not hard to see why a good portion of business is leaving China for India. At the current rate, India stands to take a lot of China's business. Because of all this, the UN predicts that India's economy is expected to grow at 6.7% in 2024, compared to the measly 5% expected by China's economy. And it's not just next year. Many organizations forecast that India's economy is expected to grow at a much faster rate for years to come, compared to China's economy. India has already started putting this growth to good use. It's now lending money to neighbors in order to avoid having them indebted to Chinese loans. It has given $8 billion to Bangladesh, $2.1 billion to bail out Sri Lanka after a recent collapse, $1.7 billion to Nepal, $13 billion to the Maldives, and a few more. While India lags far behind China in its overseas lending, New Delhi has stepped up its efforts in recent years, providing tens of billions of dollars in credit to neighboring countries, including financially distressed BRI recipients like Sri Lanka. Indian companies have also expanded rapidly in the region, providing a counterweight to Chinese commercial activity. Indian policymakers see countering BRI as vital to avoid being surrounded by pro-Chinese governments and infrastructure they speculate could one day serve Beijing's military interests. India has definitely stepped up its efforts in containing China. India publicly downplays the competition with China, but its actions show India doesn't want to be held hostage to China's economic or military might. Recently, the first bloody clashes in 45 years took place at the India-China border. But you might not have seen this news because a lot of traditional news organizations are not good at properly covering important geopolitical news. That's why I launched Global Recaps, a geopolitical newsletter that covers important geopolitical news in a simplified manner. Every evening, I send out an email directly to your inbox covering important stories that you can read in just a few minutes. Best of all, this is completely free, and you can sign up right now by clicking on the link in the description.